Alrighty then. Today is the last lecture for this quarter, and today we're going to talk about the kingdom fungi. The kingdom fungi, one of which is shown here in this picture, is primarily composed of saprophytic organisms. From our last few lectures, you know that saprophytic organisms are organisms that live on dead material. And this is why this kingdom and these organisms are so important. Trees can drop as many as 200 to 300 pounds of leaves in a fall season. And if organisms such as this don't remove the dead leaves from under the tree, after 3 or 4 seasons, the tree itself will be suffocated by its own waste. The leaves, however, are converted by these fungi into nutrients, and then the nutrients are absorbed back into the tree. This is why when you rake the ground around a leaf fall, you find such rich soil. It's because the fungi in the area have broken the tree leaves down into nutrients, and these nutrients have replenished the soil around the tree. The kingdom fungi is also the group of organisms that include yeast. Yeast organisms are pictured on the left here, and they're used to make bread as well as other foods. The yeast that's put into bread is used to make the bread rise by the production of carbon dioxide in its metabolism. It is also the mold that can ruin both bread and cheese. You know that sometimes if you leave bread out too long, you'll come back and look and there'll be this stuff growing on the bread. And that stuff that you're looking at is a fungus. These fungi are also possible pathogens that cause serious infection in humans. Now on the right here we see a not so serious situation that occurs frequently in young babies. It's called candidiasis, and this is a little colony of Candida albicans, which is a fungal infection on the baby's lips. It can also cause an infection on the tongue and the inside of the mouth. And this is easily treated, but in individuals who have a depressed immune system, these kinds of organisms can be fatal and be widespread in their effect. As you probably know from previous comments, because they're saprophytic and sometimes parasitic, most fungi are heterotrophs. Now this is kind of interesting when you look at the two kingdom system, because most fungi are grouped in the kingdom of plants. And they're actually the only organisms that are grouped in that kingdom of plants that do not undergo photosynthesis. And they're the only ones that are heterotrophs. In this system of 5 kingdoms, the fungi have their own kingdom, and they do not produce their own food. They do not undergo photosynthesis, and so they are considered heterotrophs. As I said before, most of them are saprophytes, eating dead material, but also they can exist as parasites. Parasites, as you recall, are those organisms that feed off a living host to the detriment or to the damage of that living host. Sometimes the damage is minimal, other times it can be significant. Now, fungi secrete their chemicals to digest food outside their bodies. The digestion occurs outside the body, and then they absorb the digested nutrients. This process is known as extracellular digestion, and this is what's shown in this diagram right here. This is a fungal organism, and we'll talk about these various names here in just a minute, but they secrete enzymes that break down the food material into simple sugars and then that soluble food material is then absorbed within the fungus. So this digestion here occurs outside the fungal organism, and that's why it's called extracellular digestion. Fungi reproduce by forming spores, and this is an example, and we'll talk about this in more detail in the next few slides, but these spores are produced under here in what are called gills. They are then released, and when they hit the ground, they form hyphae, and the hyphae eventually come together to form what is called a mycelium. And the mycelium is the part of the fungus that's responsible for the extracellular digestion and absorption of food. So the mycelium, which is underground here, is where all the digestion and absorption occur. And this whole part of this fungus is called a fruiting body, and we will talk about that in a few slides. The hyphae is any portion or filament or part of this mycelium, and it contains the fungal cells. Several hyphae together form this mycelium. Now here are the parts of this mushroom. The first part is called the cap. The cap is where this whole thing, as I said before, is called the fruiting body, and the cap is where the spores are located. They're actually located under here in a part that's called the gills. This is held up from the ground in another part that's called the stalk, or also known as the stipe. And then below here, this material down here is where all the digestion and absorption occurs, and this is the mycelium. And so these are the parts of this fruiting body, and then the main part of the fungus is actually underground here in the mycelium. Now, with any of hyphae and mycelium, there are two forms that are frequently used to separate different kinds of fungus. One is called a septate hyphae, and the other is the non-septate hyphae. The septate hyphae is when the hyphae is formed by individual cells that are separated from each other by cell walls. So the cell wall that separates one hyphal form from another, one cell from another, is what is the septate part of the septated hyphae. Now the cell walls are quite porous, and there's free communication across these cell walls. The non-septate hyphae, the hyphae appear as one big cell. It's actually not one big cell, but it appears that way. There are no separating walls between cells. Now, the hyphae that exists underground here, that's embedded in the material and where the fungus grows, is called rhizoid hyphae. This is what provides the digestion, as I said before, but also support and anchors the fruiting body to the ground. Other types of hyphae are the hyphae that are not in the ground, not part of the growth or support and digestion, are called aerial hyphae. Now, aerial hyphae, there are several types of aerial hyphae. An aerial hyphae that grows along the ground and can make more filaments without a union of parts or asexually is called a stolon. And this is an example of a stolon. They grow along the ground, usually underground, and then a filament will come up out of the ground in a separate place, and that's what's known as a stolon. A haulstrom is a type of hyphae that enters a host cell to absorb food, and this again can be parasitic in nature, but it's also seen in some mutualistic symbiotic relationships as well. And here's the hyphal form here. Here's the cells that the fungus is growing on. These are plant cells, And here the hyphae are penetrating the plant cells and absorbing nutrients from the plant cells. And these hyphal forms that penetrate the plant cells are called haustrum. Now, a hyphal form that produces spores is called a sporophore. A sporophore that has a cover or an enclosure is called a sporangiophore. And this is an example of a sporangiophore. Here's the cover, and then here's the sporangiophore without the cover, showing where the spores come off, and they become more and more swollen and eventually produce or extrude their spores. Now, you can also see sporophores that do not have a cover, and those are called conidiospores. And conidio is a Latin prefix that means naked, and it just means that there's no cover on the sporophore. Conifer, which also comes from the same word, means naked seed, and it's a tree that does not have a cover for its seeds. The spores don't have an enclosure, and so they're called conidiophores. And here's an example of a conidiophore. You see there's no cover, and the spores are just out there in the breeze, so to speak, and they are released. Now, the cell walls are quite flexible, and the one unique aspect of the cell wall of a fungus is that it contains something called chitin. Chitin is a chemical that is in these cell walls that provides toughness and also flexibility. Now, the largest part of a mushroom that we see is this part right here, and it's called a fruiting body. Now, the fruiting body is just a specialized part of the fungus itself. The real fungus is underground here. And this fruiting body results, and in the next slide I'm going to go through this life cycle with you. This results from the fusion of hyphae and the sexual reproduction that occurs. And so this fruiting body acts as a site for spore release. The spores are underneath here in these gills, and then the basidia or club spore holders are right under here, and they release the spores into the ground. The spores then develop into hyphae. The certain types of hyphae can mate and then produce another fruiting body. We're going to talk about that in this slide. The Basidiomycota is the first of 6 types of, or phyla of fungus that we're going to talk about. And the Basidiomycota, as it says in the book, they're not interested in you remembering all these different names for phyla. They're interested in that you realize how they differ from each other. And the unique aspect of the Basidiomycota is the fact that it forms sexual spores in club-like basidia. This is also known as a club fungus. And here are the club-like basidia. And you can see there are 2 spores in many of these, and these contain a full complement of DNA. They then, when they hit the ground, they produce hyphae. The hyphae are either male or female. It's a loose description of the term male and female, and you can see there's a negative hyphal type and a positive hyphal type. When those two come in contact, they can unite, grow together, and then you have a full complement of DMA again, and this forms what's called a button. And a button is just a membrane that grows over top a mass of hyphae. This eventually expands until you produce another fruiting body, and then the cycle goes again. So you have a release of type 1 and type 2, I'll call, instead of male and female, spores, these contain a full complement of DNA. They then grow into two mycelia, or two hyphae, that are different types. They can then fuse and produce a fully complemented hyphal form. This then grows to form a button and ultimately a fruiting body. I'm going to stop at this point. This is part 1 of the lecture, and I'm going to stop at this point. And in the next lecture, we will discuss the other 5 phyla of the fungus.